Chosen one, listen carefully. This message isn't an accident. God is preparing something you never saw coming. There is a tendency in human nature to believe that truth should always arrive dramatically. We expect a loud sign, an unmistakable miracle, or a moment so extraordinary that there can be no doubt about what God is doing. Yet Scripture, history, and even our own experiences often reveal a different pattern. The most life-changing truths rarely appear all at once. They unfold gradually, often after long seasons of uncertainty, disappointment, and unanswered questions. What feels like confusion is not always evidence of God's absence. Sometimes it is evidence that He is preparing your mind and your heart to receive a truth you could not have understood any earlier. Think about how quickly the human mind searches for certainty. Psychologists have long observed that people naturally seek patterns, even when those patterns are incomplete. We would rather accept a premature answer than remain in uncertainty. But faith asks us to do something profoundly different. Faith teaches us to remain patient when every instinct demands immediate clarity. It invites us to trust that understanding has its own appointed time. This is one of the greatest spiritual paradoxes. We often pray for answers while God is first preparing us to ask better questions. We ask, "Why is this happening to me?" while God gently redirects our attention toward, "What is this season producing within me?" That shift changes everything. One question looks backward with frustration, the other looks forward with expectation. Throughout the Bible, this pattern appears repeatedly. Joseph did not understand why betrayal preceded promotion. Moses could not have imagined that years in the wilderness would become preparation for leading a nation. David was anointed as king long before he ever sat on the throne. Each experienced a gap between promise and fulfillment. That gap was not empty. It was a classroom. It was where character was shaped, pride was refined, and dependence on God became stronger than dependence on circumstances. Perhaps that is where you find yourself today. You may feel caught between what God has promised and what your eyes can currently see. It is tempting to interpret the silence as rejection or the delay as failure. Yet silence is not always abandonment. Sometimes silence is where wisdom grows. A seed buried beneath the ground appears inactive, but beneath the surface, an unseen transformation is taking place. By the time growth becomes visible, much of the real work has already been completed. The same principle applies to your life. Long before your circumstances change, God may already be changing your perspective. And perspective is often the doorway through which truth enters. Two people can face the same challenge and leave with completely different futures, not because the challenge was different, but because their interpretation was different. One sees only obstacles. The other discovers purpose hidden within difficulty. This is why confusion should never be your final conclusion. Confusion is often temporary. It is the mind recognizing that its old understanding no longer explains reality. Before new wisdom can take root, old assumptions must be challenged. That process can feel uncomfortable because certainty is being replaced with humility. Yet humility is fertile ground for divine instruction. God rarely fills a heart that already believes it knows everything. He speaks most clearly to those who remain teachable. There is also another truth we often overlook. God's perspective. We measure life by calendars and deadlines. God measures it by transformation. While we focus on changing our circumstances, He focuses on changing our character. And character always outlasts circumstances. Success without wisdom is fragile. Blessing without maturity is difficult to sustain. That is why God sometimes develops the person before He delivers the promise. So instead of asking whether God has forgotten you, ask whether He is preparing you. Instead of assuming that uncertainty is your enemy, consider that it may be the very environment where deeper faith is formed. The greatest revelations often come after the greatest questions, because a searching heart is finally ready to recognize what was present all along. When truth finally becomes clear, you often realize that God was guiding you through every moment of uncertainty, not to confuse you, but to transform you into someone capable of seeing with faith instead of fear. Remember this. The season that feels most uncertain today may become the evidence tomorrow that God was leading you all along. What happens after clarity begins to emerge is often more challenging than the confusion that came before. Most people assume that once God reveals the truth, life immediately becomes easier. Yet the opposite is frequently true. Clarity simplifies your direction, but it complicates your decisions because now you can no longer claim that you did not know. Once light enters a room, every hidden corner becomes visible. Once God exposes what is real, you are invited to leave behind everything that depended on illusion. One of the most difficult realities to accept is that not everything that appears good is necessarily God's best. Human beings are naturally drawn to appearances. We evaluate people by charm, opportunities by immediate rewards, and situations by how they make us feel in the present moment. Yet feelings, while valuable, are not always faithful guides. They fluctuate with circumstances, emotions, and expectations. Truth, however, remains constant, whether we recognize it immediately or not. This is why spiritual discernment is one of the greatest gifts a person can develop. Discernment is not suspicion. It is not living in fear or assuming the worst about everyone around you. Discernment is the disciplined ability to distinguish what merely looks attractive from what is genuinely aligned with God's purpose. It asks a deeper question than, do I want this? It asks, does this move me closer to the person God is calling me to become? Consider how often Scripture reminds us that appearances can deceive. The prophet Samuel initially believed Eliab looked like the obvious choice to become Israel's next king. He was strong, impressive, and carried himself with confidence. Yet God interrupted Samuel's assumptions with words that remain timeless. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That single truth challenges nearly every instinct of modern culture. We are trained to admire what is visible. God begins with what is invisible. The same principle applies far beyond people. Sometimes an opportunity seems perfect because it promises comfort, recognition, or financial security. Yet beneath the surface, it quietly pulls your attention away from your values, your calling, or your relationship with God. Other times, the path that appears difficult is precisely the one that produces lasting peace. The difference is rarely obvious at first. That is why patience is so closely connected to wisdom. Time reveals what excitement often conceals. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. The human brain is wired to favor immediate rewards over long-term outcomes. We naturally seek what relieves today's discomfort, even if it creates tomorrow's regret. God consistently invites us to reverse that pattern. Faith teaches us to value eternal significance over temporary satisfaction. It trains us to ask not merely what is easy, but what is right. There are also relationships that survive only because the truth has not yet been acknowledged. Some connections are built on convenience rather than commitment. Others are sustained by expectations that were never healthy in the first place. When God begins revealing truth, those foundations are tested. This can be painful because letting go of illusion often feels like losing something valuable. In reality, you are making room for something authentic. Think of a sculptor standing before a massive block of marble. To someone watching, every strike of the hammer appears destructive. Pieces fall away. Dust fills the air. It looks as though something is being lost. Yet the sculptor sees what others cannot. Every fragment removed reveals the masterpiece hidden within the stone. God's work in your life often follows the same pattern. What He removes is not punishment, it is preparation. Every false belief, every unhealthy attachment, every misplaced confidence that falls away creates space for the person you were created to become. This is why resisting God's truth is ultimately more painful than accepting it. Illusion may provide temporary comfort, but it can never provide lasting freedom. Truth sometimes wounds our pride, but it heals our lives. It challenges the stories we have told ourselves, exposes the excuses we have relied upon, and invites us into a deeper way of living, one rooted not in appearances, but in reality. As you continue this journey, remember that God's goal is not simply to make you feel better. His goal is to make you wiser, stronger, and more faithful. He is not interested in preserving comfortable illusions when He intends to give you something infinitely greater. the freedom that comes from seeing life through his perspective. Never fear the truth God reveals, because every illusion he removes is making room for a future built on what can never be shaken. One of the greatest turning points in any person's life comes when they realize that the deepest battle was never primarily against other people. It is easy to believe that if certain individuals had treated you differently, if circumstances had been more favorable, or if life had been fairer, everything would have turned out differently. While people can certainly hurt us, and circumstances can challenge us, the most decisive battlefield has always been the one within. Before God transforms your situation, he often transforms your perspective. And once your perspective changes, you begin to see that many of the chains holding you back were not around your hands, they were around your mind. This is a difficult truth because it requires personal responsibility. Human nature prefers external explanations. It is more comfortable to blame difficult people, unfortunate timing, or bad luck than to examine the beliefs that quietly shape our decisions every single day. Yet Scripture repeatedly points inward before it points outward. It reminds us that as a person thinks, so they become. The direction of your life is often determined long before your feet begin moving. It begins with the thoughts you allow to remain unquestioned. Fear is one of the most powerful forces that distort perspective. Fear convinces you that the worst outcome is the most likely outcome. It magnifies uncertainty until it feels like certainty. It whispers that failure is inevitable, rejection is permanent, and tomorrow will simply repeat yesterday. The remarkable thing about fear is that it rarely needs evidence. It survives on imagination. It constructs stories about the future that have never happened and persuades you to live as though they already have. Doubt operates differently, but it is equally deceptive. Doubt does not always shout. More often, it speaks quietly. It asks subtle questions that slowly weaken confidence. What if you're not capable? What if you've misunderstood God's direction? What if everyone else is right and you're wrong? These questions are not harmful simply because they exist. Honest questions can deepen faith. The danger comes when doubt becomes your permanent lens instead of a temporary visitor. A question that should lead you toward God begins pulling you away from trusting him. Then there is pride, perhaps the most overlooked obstacle of all. Pride is not merely thinking too highly of yourself. It can also appear as the refusal to admit weakness, the unwillingness to seek wisdom, or the insistence that your understanding is complete. Ironically, pride and insecurity often wear different masks while serving the same purpose. Both keep a person from surrendering fully to God's guidance. One says, "I already know enough." The other says, "I will never be enough." Both prevent genuine growth because both keep the focus on self rather than on God. This is why the renewal of the mind is central to spiritual transformation. God does not simply ask us to behave differently. He invites us to think differently. Every lasting change begins with a renewed perspective. When your thinking changes, your choices begin to change. When your choices change, your habits change. When your habits change, your future gradually changes as well. Transformation is rarely instantaneous. It is the quiet accumulation of faithful decisions made from a new way of seeing the world. Consider the disciples during the storm on the Sea of Galilee. The waves were real, the wind was real, the danger was not imagined. Yet while they saw only chaos, Jesus saw an opportunity to reveal a deeper truth about trust. The external circumstances remained the same for a time, but the invitation was to adopt a different perspective. Peace was available before the storm ended, because peace was never dependent on the absence of difficulty. It was dependent on the presence of faith. The same principle applies to your own life. There may be situations today that cannot immediately be changed. There may be unanswered prayers, unexpected delays, or challenges that seem beyond your control. But even when circumstances remain unchanged, your perspective does not have to remain imprisoned. You can choose to see obstacles as opportunities for growth, delays as seasons of preparation, and uncertainty as an invitation to trust more deeply. That choice does not deny reality, it transforms the way you engage with it. when you stop allowing fear to interpret your future, when you refuse to let doubt define your identity, and when you surrender your perspective to God's wisdom, something extraordinary happens. You become less controlled by circumstances and more anchored in purpose. The world around you may still be uncertain, but the world within you becomes steady. That is why God's greatest work is often invisible before it becomes visible. He changes the lens before he changes the landscape. He reshapes the heart before he rearranges the circumstances. And once your perspective aligns with his truth, you discover that the greatest victory was never over the people or problems around you. It was over the limitations that once lived within you. The moment you begin seeing your life through God's perspective instead of your fears is the moment your future begins to change. The moment truth becomes clear, something remarkable happens. The question is no longer, what is God trying to show me? The question becomes, what will I do with what he has shown me? This is where many people discover that revelation is only the beginning. Knowing the truth is powerful, but acting on the truth is what transforms a life. Every meaningful change in history, every great act of faith recorded in Scripture began with someone who chose obedience over comfort. There is a common misconception that once God reveals his direction, the path ahead will become effortless. Yet throughout the Bible, revelation almost always introduces responsibility. Noah received clear instructions, but he still had to build the ark while everyone around him doubted him. Abraham was given a promise, but he still had to leave behind everything familiar before he could experience its fulfillment. Peter recognized Jesus as the Messiah, but recognition alone was not enough. Eventually, he had to step out of the boat and walk toward the one he claimed to trust. This reveals a profound psychological truth. Information alone rarely changes behavior. Most people already know what they should do. They know they should forgive, but resentment feels safer. They know they should let go of unhealthy relationships, but familiarity feels more comfortable than uncertainty. They know they should pursue the purpose God has placed in their hearts, but fear whispers that failure is inevitable. The issue is seldom a lack of knowledge. It is the struggle between conviction and comfort. Comfort has an extraordinary influence over the human mind. It convinces us that remaining where we are is less risky than moving toward where God is calling us. Even when our present situation is painful, it is at least predictable. The unknown, however, requires trust. That is why so many people stay in situations they have already outgrown. They are not trapped by circumstances as much as they are trapped by the fear of change. Yet every significant transformation requires crossing a threshold. There comes a moment when you cannot remain who you were and become who God is calling you to be at the same time. Every new season demands the courage to release an old identity. Sometimes that means letting go of old habits. Sometimes it means releasing past disappointments. Sometimes it means walking away from voices that have constantly reminded you of your failures instead of your potential. Whatever it is, obedience always costs something before it gives something greater. This is why courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing what is right even while fear is still present. Faith is often misunderstood as complete confidence, but biblical faith is much deeper than that. Faith is moving forward because God's character is trustworthy, even when your emotions have not yet caught up with your decision. Your feelings may hesitate, your mind may ask questions, and your circumstances may remain uncertain, but your commitment to God's truth becomes stronger than all of them. There is another reason obedience feels difficult. Every decision shapes identity. The choices you repeatedly make become the person you eventually become. When you repeatedly choose fear, fear slowly defines your future. When you repeatedly choose faith, faith gradually reshapes your character. This is why God is so concerned with daily obedience rather than occasional inspiration. A single emotional moment may encourage you, but consistent obedience transforms you. Think of a river carving through solid rock. It does not accomplish its work through one powerful moment. It changes the landscape through persistent movement over time. In the same way, your life is not transformed by one extraordinary decision alone. It is transformed by countless faithful decisions that seem small in the moment but become extraordinary when viewed over the course of years. Every act of obedience, every prayer offered in sincerity, every choice to forgive, every refusal to surrender to despair is quietly shaping a future that you cannot yet fully see. This is why hesitation is so dangerous. Delayed obedience often becomes disguised disobedience. We tell ourselves we are simply waiting for the perfect opportunity, greater confidence, or clearer confirmation. Yet there comes a point when God has already revealed enough for the next step. He rarely illuminates the entire journey at once, because doing so would eliminate the need for trust. Instead, he provides enough light for today's step, trusting that tomorrow's light will appear when today's obedience has been fulfilled. As you continue forward, remember that God's purpose is never fulfilled through good intentions alone. It is fulfilled through willing hearts that respond to his voice. The truth he reveals is not meant to remain an inspiring thought. It is meant to become the foundation upon which you build your life. Every revelation is an invitation. Every invitation requires a decision, and every decision moves you either closer to your calling or back toward your comfort. So if God has been speaking to your heart, do not wait for fear to disappear before you respond. Fear may linger, but faith grows every time you choose obedience. The future you have been praying for often begins with the simple decision to take the next faithful step today. God does not ask you to see the entire road ahead. He asks you to trust him enough to take the next step, because one act of obedience can change the direction of your entire life. There is a fascinating truth that only becomes visible when you look at life through the lens of time. While we are living through painful seasons, we almost always interpret them as interruptions. We see delays as obstacles, disappointments as failures, and unanswered prayers as evidence that nothing is happening. But when we look back years later, we often discover that those very moments were quietly shaping us into the person we needed to become. What once appeared to be God's silence was, in reality, his preparation. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of faith. We ask God to change our circumstances, while he is often more concerned with changing us. That does not mean our circumstances are unimportant. It simply means that God understands something we frequently overlook. A changed environment without a changed character rarely produces lasting transformation. If the person remains the same patterns eventually recreate the same problems. Becomes strong because it is protected from every storm. It becomes strong because its roots grow deeper while resisting the wind. Remove every challenge, and the tree may grow quickly, but it will remain fragile. The first major storm will expose what years of comfort concealed. Human character develops in much the same way. Strength is not produced in moments of ease. It is forged in seasons that require endurance. The human mind naturally resists this idea because we are conditioned to associate progress with visible results. We celebrate promotions, achievements, financial success, and answered prayers because they can be measured. Yet some of God's greatest work cannot be measured at all. You cannot place humility on a scale. You cannot calculate wisdom with numbers. You cannot quantify a heart that has learned patience, compassion, or forgiveness. Nevertheless, these invisible qualities often determine the direction of an entire life far more than external success ever could. Think about Joseph once again. Had God answered his prayers immediately after his brothers betrayed him, Joseph might have escaped slavery, but he would never have become the leader capable of saving nations from famine. Every hardship he experienced seemed unnecessary in the moment. Yet each season developed something essential within him. Betrayal taught resilience. Servitude taught humility. Prison taught patience. Leadership eventually required all three. This pattern appears throughout Scripture because it reflects God's consistent way of working. Moses spent decades in the wilderness before leading Israel. David spent years running from Saul before becoming king. Even Jesus lived quietly for many years before his public ministry began. Preparation occupied far more time than public recognition. In a culture obsessed with instant success, this truth feels almost revolutionary. God is rarely in a hurry because he values depth more than speed. Psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Lasting growth requires repetition. Character is built through consistent choices repeated over time. Every challenge presents an opportunity to strengthen a particular virtue. Every disappointment invites deeper trust. Every delay teaches perseverance. The remarkable thing is that these lessons often become visible only after the season has ended. While living through them, they feel frustrating. Looking back, they become invaluable. Perhaps there have been prayers you believed God ignored. Doors you desperately wanted to open remain firmly closed. Relationships you expected to last suddenly ended. Opportunities you worked tirelessly to pursue disappeared without explanation. At the time, those experiences may have seemed like evidence that life was moving against you. But what if those closed doors were acts of protection rather than rejection? What if God was preserving you from paths that looked promising but ultimately would have led you away from his purpose? This is where gratitude begins to transform the past. Gratitude is not pretending painful experiences were enjoyable. It is recognizing that even difficult experiences can produce lasting wisdom. When you begin to view your history through God's faithfulness rather than your disappointments, the narrative changes completely. You stop seeing yourself merely as someone who survived hardships. You begin seeing yourself as someone who was being prepared through them. Preparation also changes the way you approach the future. Instead of fearing delays, you begin asking what they are teaching you. Instead of resenting difficult seasons, you become curious about the strength they are producing. This perspective does not remove pain, but it gives pain purpose. And purpose has an extraordinary ability to transform endurance into hope. There is another remarkable reality about preparation. It often feels ordinary while it is happening. Day after day, nothing appears to change. Yet just as water slowly shapes stone through persistence rather than force, God quietly shapes lives through countless ordinary moments. A conversation, a disappointment, an unexpected detour, a prayer offered in weakness. Each becomes another stroke in the masterpiece he is creating. The process may seem slow, but slow does not mean stagnant. Invisible progress is still progress. So if you find yourself in a season where answers seem delayed, resist the temptation to believe that nothing is happening. The greatest work God performs is often beneath the surface, where no one else can see it. He is developing wisdom before influence, humility before promotion, faith before fulfillment, and character before blessing. When the right moment arrives, you will discover that what felt like waiting was actually becoming. One day you will look back on this chapter, not with regret, but with gratitude, because you will realize that every delay, every disappointment, and every unanswered question was preparing you for a purpose far greater than you could have imagined. Never underestimate a season of waiting, because what feels like a delay in your life may be God's greatest preparation for the destiny that lies ahead.